Hello hockey fans and welcome back to another video. The Stanley Cup has been awarded, the month of July is in full swing and trade rumours are running rampant once again, which can only mean one thing folks, the NHL offseason has officially begun. And what better way to kick off the festivities than with the 2022 NHL Entry Draft. Now while the draft is set to take place just a few hours after this video goes out, and while pretty much every single hockey channel on this platform has been discussing this event for quite some time now, I want to talk about a different draft instead. Thanks to the response I received on my 2012 draft video a few weeks ago, I want to dive back into the history books and explore another event that has aged really, really badly. And what better one to choose than the 1999 NHL Draft? After all, given the quantity of first round draft picks that made a minimal impact in the league, if any at all, and given the sizable number of prospects that failed to live up to their sky-high potential, there is a legitimate argument to be made that the 1999 draft was one of, if not the worst draft in the history of the NHL. Yeah, it really wasn't a good one, folks. But why was this draft such a mess? How many players didn't pan out, and why were so many of the top prospects unable to live up to the hype? Well, let's take a look at the event in a little more detail and try to find out, shall we? So in today's video, join me as we explore why the 1999 NHL Entry Draft was a complete disaster. Now, in order to examine just how terrible this draft was, let's take a look at every single first round draft pick that turned out to be a complete and utter bust. And to do so, let's begin with the latest pick in the first round and work all the way to the very top of the draft order. I do hope you're sitting comfortably, folks, because there's going to be a lot of players to look through here. Kicking things off, we have the 28th overall pick by the New York Islanders, Christian Kudrach. Oh boy, we sure are starting as we mean to go on, aren't we folks? Do any of you even know or remember who Christian Kudrach is? I wouldn't blame you if you didn't, folks. I mean, I had no idea either. The Slovakian defenseman suited up in just 26 NHL games over parts of 3 seasons and scored only 4 points during that span, before spending the rest of his pro hockey career either down in the minors or overseas in Europe. Sure, Kudrach was the final selection in the first round, and he certainly could have been taken in the second round instead, depending on which team held the final pick, but unfortunately for him though, Mike Milbury was the Islanders' general manager at the time of this draft, and we all know how much he loved to make terrible decisions for his team. How he was employed in an NHL front office for so long is far beyond me, folks. Moving on to the 27th overall pick by the New Jersey Devils, Ari Ahonen. Well, it's a good thing that the Devils had Martin Brodeur between the pipes, because if they were expecting Ahonen to lead them to their next 2 Stanley Cup championships, they would have been really, really disappointed. Now, the Finnish netminder would find himself on an NHL roster on several occasions over a 3-year span, but unfortunately for him, he never played a single NHL game during this period. I sure hope Ahonen made the most of his time on the bench, because that's the closest he ever came to playing in the NHL. He better have taken a few pictures while he was there too, because they lasted a hell of a lot longer than the real thing for him. Next, we have the 25th overall selection by the Colorado Avalanche, Mikhail Kuleshov. Now, while Colorado did a lot of things right during the late 90s and early 2000s, drafting Kuleshov in the first round certainly wasn't one of them. The Russian forward played just 3 games in the NHL, and he went scoreless in the process, before spending the rest of his pro career either in the AHL or overseas in Europe instead. Interestingly, Kuleshov would hang up his skates and retire from the sport altogether only 7 years after his selection at the draft. So I think it's fair to say that Colorado wasted their premier pick, late first rounder or not. Now we have the 24th overall pick by the Toronto Maple Leafs, Luka Sereda. You want to know why you haven't won a Stanley Cup since 1967, Toronto? It's because you keep drafting players like this in the first round. I wish I could say that this was an isolated incident for that organisation, but we all know it isn't. The Swiss forward never played a single NHL game during his career, and he instead spent his time either in the minors or back home in Switzerland. Now, despite this underwhelming career, Sereda has produced a long and successful coaching career in the Swiss National League back home, so it looks like he's found far more success behind the bench than he ever did while sitting on it, at least for Toronto anyway. On to the 22nd overall selection by the Philadelphia Flyers, Maxime Ouellet. Now, some of you may have thought that it was only the European players that didn't pan out during the 1999 draft. And while there's a lot of players in this video that do hail from overseas, oh boy are you mistaken, and Ouellet is the first of many reasons why. The Canadian netminder suited up in just 12 NHL games over parts of 4 seasons, where he posted a rather abysmal 2-6-2 record, a 3.08 goals against average, and a .903 save percentage during that span. So that's 2 different goalies that clearly didn't pan out from the first round. Surely there won't be another one, right? There couldn't possibly be a third netminder in this video, right? Right? Next up is the 20th overall pick by the Buffalo Sabres, Barrett Heiston. Oh, Buffalo, you make it all the way to the Stanley Cup Finals, you fall at the final hurdle via a controversial goal, and you follow it up by drafting this guy? Well, this year was just full of disappointments for you, eh, Buffalo? The American forward took to the ice in just 10 NHL games and went scoreless in that span, before spending the rest of his pro hockey career playing for a variety of minor league teams across North America. Now, Heiston may be the only American player to be featured in this video, but he certainly doesn't look out of place compared to everybody else, does he? I just wish I could say the same about his NHL career though. Now we have the 19th overall selection by the Phoenix Coyotes, Kirill Safronov. What's that? Phoenix drafted a player in the first round that didn't live up to his potential? Well, colour me shocked, folks. The Russian defenseman played just 35 NHL games and scored only 4 points in the process, before spending the rest of his career elsewhere in the hockey world. Now, while Safronov's NHL career didn't exactly pan out, unfortunately for the Coyotes, their other first-round pick that year would fare even worse than he did. Speaking of which, moving on to the 15th overall pick by the Phoenix Coyotes, Scott Kellman. Oh, Phoenix, you had 2 picks in the middle of the first round and you managed to miss on both of them? If that doesn't perfectly encapsulate the Coyotes franchise as a whole, I don't know what does, folks. Now, the Canadian forward never played a single NHL game during his career, and instead plied his trade in various minor leagues across North America. He did play his final season in the UK's Elite Ice Hockey League, but you know your career is on its last legs when you find yourself in the EIHL. Get upset with me all you like, UK hockey fans, we both know it's true, okay? So not only did they whiff on Safronov, but they also drafted another bust in Kellman too. Wow, the Coyotes really didn't have a good draft that year, did they, folks? Well, at least they would go on to have plenty of success over the next 2 decades, and their organisation would completely avoid any unnecessary controversy in the many years that followed, right guys? Wait a minute. Next up is the 13th overall choice by the Edmonton Oilers, Yanni Rita. What's that? The Edmonton Oilers drafted a bust with their premier pick of the draft? Say it ain't so, guys! Well, at least they didn't pick first overall that year. They were kind enough to let another team take that train wreck instead. How nice of them. The Finnish forward suited up in 66 NHL games over parts of 4 seasons and scored 14 points during that span, before spending the rest of his pro career back home in Finland. Now, while it's always great to see a player find success in their native country, Rita probably should have translated that success to North America instead, especially considering he was the 13th highest selection of his entire draft class. Yeah, you kinda needed to do a little bit better than that, Rita, okay? Now we have the 12th overall pick by the Florida Panthers, Denis Shvidki. Another Russian player that didn't reach his potential, because we haven't seen enough of those already, have we, folks? Shvidki took to the ice in 76 NHL games and scored 25 points for his efforts, before taking his talents back across the pond and playing out the rest of his career with a variety of teams in Europe. Sure, Shvidki's NHL career was almost as brief as everyone else's in this video, but it seems like he lasted significantly longer in the show than nearly everyone else we have looked at so far. He may have been the best of a bad bunch, but that really isn't saying much, is it? We've reached the top 10 of the draft order, and while we only have a few more players to focus on, that doesn't mean that they have fared any better than the other players we have discussed so far in this video. Strap yourselves in, folks, because we're about to see some real stinkers. Starting with the 6th overall pick by the Nashville Predators, we have Brian Finley. Oh great, another netminder that didn't pan out. Perhaps using your first round selection on a goalie wasn't the best idea that year. You know, seeing as none of them worked out in the long run and all. The Canadian netminder played just 4 NHL games during his career, where he posted a rather terrible 0-2-0 record, a 4.70 goals against average, and a .851 save percentage during that span. Now, I don't care how unique the goaltending position is, or how difficult it is for a netminder to reach their full potential. Posting abysmal stats like those as the 6th highest selection of your draft class simply isn't good enough. After all, Nashville's franchise was only 2 years old at the time. Brian Finley was supposed to be their starting goaltender of the future, and he wasn't. There's no excuse for him not panning out. I'm sorry Finley, I'm sorry Nashville, this pick sucked. Penultimately, we have the 4th overall selection by the New York Rangers, Pavel Brendel. Oh, New York, you had a top 5 pick in the draft and you took Brendel? Well, no wonder you had to keep overpaying for free agents. You couldn't draft a superstar if he punched you in the face. Brendel suited up in 78 NHL games and scored 22 points for his efforts, before spending the rest of his pro career back overseas, where he bounced between a plethora of teams across Europe. Now, I don't think you need me to tell you that this pick aged very, very poorly. After all, Brendel was one of the top players of his entire age group, and he was taken with one of the highest selections at the event, yet he played less than 100 NHL games during his career. You can't really get much worse than that, can you? It's a good thing that I was only 3 years old at the time, and I had absolutely no idea who the New York Rangers were, because if I saw this pick take place, I probably would have chosen a different team to cheer for, you know. And finally, at number 1, both the highest and the most disappointing pick from the 1999 NHL Draft, Patrick Stefan. When you're remembered more for an empty net blunder than you are for your legitimate career achievements, you know that your NHL career has been one hell of a disappointment. The Czech forward suited up in 455 NHL games over parts of 7 seasons in the show and scored 188 points during that span, before calling it a day on his career following a 3-game stint in Switzerland during the 07-08 season. Sure, Stefan played a lot more games than every other player we have looked at in this video, and he scored far more points too, but considering he was regarded as the best player of his age group, and he was chosen with the premier pick in his draft class, only 455 games and just 188 points during that span isn't good enough, plain and simple. In fact, Stefan's career has been deemed so disappointing that there is a legitimate argument to be made that he is one of, if not the worst first overall draft pick the NHL has ever seen. Hell, even Nail Yakupov's career was probably better than this guy, and he's regarded as the biggest bust since the dawn of the 21st century. If Stefan isn't the perfect example of just how terrible this draft turned out to be, I don't know what is, folks. So of the 28 players taken in the first round of the 1999 NHL Entry Draft, 13 of them turned out to be complete and utter busts, either due to them playing minimal time in the NHL or them never even making it to the show in the first place. That's almost half of the entire first round of the draft. Oh, but what about all these other players, Oddman Rush? What about the first round picks that made it to the show but still didn't live up to the hype? Well, it might surprise you to learn that I only focused on the first rounders who suited up in less than 100 NHL games during their career. Except for Patrick Stefan, of course. This draft class was so horribly bad that I had to limit myself to those players who suited up in less than 100 games for the sake of time, and we still ended up talking about 13 different players. Yeah, this draft was abysmal, folks. If that's not bad enough though, 21 of the 28 first round picks that year played less than 500 NHL games during their respective careers. 21 of 28. That's exactly 75% of the entire first round. Sure, not every first rounder will go on to produce a lengthy career in the show, and it's very difficult to predict how a player will pan out in the many years that follow, but given that 3/4 of the players selected produced decent careers at best, and absolutely non-existent ones at worst, you can see why this draft is still regarded as one of, if not the worst events in NHL history, can't you? Seems to me like the 1999 draft was one to remember, but unfortunately it was for all the wrong reasons. Despite the sizable number of terrible selections, it is worth mentioning that the first round did include some pretty great picks too. For example, the Sedin twins were taken at 2nd and 3rd overall, former Rookie of the Year Barrett Jackman was taken 17th overall, while longtime NHL forward Taylor Pyatt was taken 8th overall too. Now while the first round clearly didn't work out for most teams, there was plenty of talent that appeared in the later rounds of the 1999 draft. For example, Mike Commodore, Adam Hall and Jordan Leopold were all taken in the second round of the event. Nicholas Hagman, Chris Kelly and Craig Anderson were some of the many long-time NHLers taken in the third round, while Ryan Malone, Ryan Miller and Martin Erat are just a few names taken during the later rounds too. And that's not even mentioning 7th round draft picks Henrik Zetterberg and Radim Verbata, both of whom played over 1,000 regular season games during their respective careers. In fact, of the 244 players that were taken outside of the first round, 87 of them would suit up in their NHL debut. Not only that, of those 87 players, 39 of them played at least 100 NHL games, 16 of them played at least 500 games, while 6 of them played at least 750 games, which is quite the achievement given that most late round picks are long shots to even crack an NHL roster, let alone spend much of their pro careers in the show. So based on what we have discovered in this video, I think we can all agree that the 1999 NHL Entry Draft was a complete and utter disaster. Sure, there were several diamonds in the rough, and some players even produced Hall of Fame careers, but given that so many first round picks failed to make a sizable impact in the show, if any at all, and given that most of these selections were unable to live up to their lofty hype, you cannot possibly call this draft a success, especially compared to the many events in the years before and after too. The 2022 draft may not be the best in NHL history, and it might lack some serious generational talent, but it should rest easy knowing that it will probably turn out a hell of a lot better than 1999. After all, practically every single pick would have to go terribly wrong for it to come anywhere close to this train wreck. There's almost zero chance of that happening this year. Right? And on that note, I'm going to end today's video. That was a look at why the 1999 NHL Entry Draft was a complete disaster. What do you guys think about this event and the players who were selected in it too? Do you think that it was one of the worst drafts in NHL history, or do you think that it was better than people give it credit for? Also, is there another draft you would like me to make a video on in the future? Let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys think. But thank you very much for watching guys, I hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye! A big thank you to Clayton Hallam, Drew Fawcett, Houston NG, Lucas Gates, Raquel and Worthless Pieces for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.